Despite the disappointments, Uncle Warren emerged from office proud of his accomplishments. He returned to Charleston with his family to await the next U.S. Senate race. But within a week of returning home, a single phone call changed everything.
During Warren's second term in office, there were friends who had thrown their weight around, and that it was causing favors to be extended to them. That played into the hands of an angry president named Richard Nixon. Nixon was getting a lot of bad publicity over Vietnam. It looked like he might be impeached over Watergate. And he told his attorney general, go out after any Democratic governor who is not eligible to run for re-election and investigate them. What President Nixon wanted to do, we were told, by having the attorney general do this, was divert the news media from focusing on him and Watergate. He in effect was saying, give them something else to think about, show them how bad those Democrats are, so they won't be focused entirely on me. And so an investigation was launched into Hearnes by a grand jury in Kansas City.
The purpose of the investigation was unknown. Supposedly, Warren was a target because he was rumored to be a possible vice presidential candidate with Senator Edmund Muskie. Muskie's candidacy was eventually threatened, and Uncle Warren's name was dropped as a potential candidate. But his early popularity and the rumors that began during his second term in office led to a media frenzy. During the investigation, the grand jury asked to see my uncle's personal papers dating back to the time he was in law school. Fortunately, a complete and accurate account of his financial matters had been kept by his very thorough CPA and brother, Bob. But despite my uncle's willingness to oblige, the U.S. attorneys in charge of the investigation refused to provide him with any information on what exactly it was they were looking for.
I was called, just about everybody was called, but there was nothing to tell except the truth. It was incomprehensible for 3 years that they did all of this stuff.
Stuff like forcing my uncle to meet investigators at a bank where years prior he'd kept a safety deposit box. Despite my uncle's claims that the box was no longer being used, the investigators insisted on taking a look inside. So the box was opened, and the contents revealed a single brown rubber band. Fed up with the scrutiny, Uncle Warren decided to take matters into his own hands. Ignoring the advice of his attorneys, he made the unheard-of request to testify personally before the grand jury.
He went 3 days and 2 nights before the grand jury and answered all their questions. It was the smartest move he ever made, because after 3 days and 2 nights, they didn't have any questions that were unanswered.
When it was all over, it didn't work, of course. When it was all over, it did not serve Richard Nixon's purpose because he lost ultimately on Watergate. When it was all over in Missouri, it did not work because the grand jury, in effect, said, we find nothing wrong.
Nothing wrong, except that the government spent millions of dollars on an investigation that simply uncovered a refund that the IRS owed my uncle of $51.
I remember when the headline came out and said that we have looked into the Hearnes file, there's no reason for an investigation. Yeah, I remember that. So does everybody else. It was like you wanted to go out and kick a tree because the 5 years were gone. The damage was done.
Uncle Warren was eventually successful in a libel lawsuit against the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for their intense negative coverage during the investigation. But his political career was badly bruised.
You are tomorrow. You are the spirit of America.
Chances are you're fed up with politics, with the rising crime rate.
His run for U.S. Senate in 1976 was unsuccessful, as was an attempt at state auditor 2 years later. Within time, he was appointed as a circuit judge, making him the first person in the state's history to serve in all 3 branches of government. Years later, under the Freedom of Information Act, Uncle Warren requested copies of the transcripts from the grand jury trial. Yet once received, another injustice was discovered, as the names of many of the participants and most of their testimony had been blacked out. But included in that file was a copy of a letter ordering a full investigation of Hearnes, sent from the White House to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. Uncle Warren and Aunt Betty returned to Charleston to be near the friends and family that had supported them through it all. Despite all the disappointment, Uncle Warren's desire to serve the people continued. He became the executive director of Southeast Missouri Legal Services, and for the next 17 years he represented civil suits for the poorest members of Southeast Missouri society. This was a career that he found to be most rewarding. No hardship could defeat his loyalty to the people. In 1978, Aunt Betty followed Uncle Warren's lead and began her own 10-year career as a state representative for Mississippi County. In 1985, she was the first woman in the state's history to run for governor. She lost to John Ashcroft, but the couple's devotion to the state of Missouri would not be forgotten. Eventually, numerous educational and medical buildings throughout the state were named in the Hearnes' honor.
Well, I admired them both very much. They worked so hard. They worked so hard.
I think on the whole, when people look back, it was a very successful 8 years because education improved, mental health, the state had a good economy, and it was going places.
I think his main priorities truly were to serve the people, in the sense that he would support legislation and initiate legislation that he thought was in the best interest of all of the people of the state, and he was very successful at it.
I'm proud that he came from from a little town and worked his way up and ran and made a great governor. And I hope the state will remember, and they will. Because I hear people say, well, I wish we had him back. He's the best governor we ever had. Of course, I'm sure they'll say that about somebody else too, but that's all right. He's my governor.
He changed the face of the state by beating the establishment. It was that simple. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable, but true. Sure, Uncle Warren wasn't perfect. Even he'll tell you that. He was just one man from a little town in Missouri who had a dream to serve his country. And it wasn't a dream of notoriety or personal acquisition, but rather an understanding of his personal responsibility, no matter the price, even that of his name, to fight for a better life for his country, his state, his friends, and his family. My family. Me. I guess now I understand what a great uncle really is.